We are live.
Hello, I'm Paul Sparrow, Director of the Franklin Roosevelt Presidential Library Museum. Welcome to our keynote address, Auschwitz, What We Know Now, What We Knew Then, delivered by the remarkable Michael Berenbaum. This session is being live streamed and recorded and will be available in the YouTube channel of the Franklin Roosevelt Library and Museum. Only registered attendees are able to participate in the question and answer session after the presentation, but it is being live streamed. This is the final session of our 2021 virtual conference, Examining American Responses to the Holocaust, Digital Possibilities, hosted by the Roosevelt Institute and the FDR Library. This conference has been dedicated to Ambassador William Vanden Heuvel, who supported the FDR Library for many years before he died, and whose generosity launched the Morgenthau Holocaust Project in 2017. I'd also like to thank the Krupp Foundation for their generous support. We are honored to have Michael Barronbaum deliver our keynote address. He is the director of the Zvi Searing Institute, exploring the ethical and religious implications of the Holocaust, and a professor of Jewish studies at the American Jewish University. He was project director of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and the first director of the Research Institute, and later served as president and CEO of the Survivors of the Shoah Visual History Foundation. The author and editor of 20 books, he's also the executive editor of the new Encyclopedia Judaica, as well as the original. His work in film has won Emmy Awards and Academy Awards, and he won the Simon Rockower Memorial Award of the American Jewish Press Association 3 times in 2 years. Thank you, Dr. Berenbaum, for joining us today. I turn the stage over to you.
Okay, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me, and it's an important topic and important consideration. I'm going to present a good deal of material, but the first piece of material I want to examine is a small book published by Israel's most distinguished and most important Holocaust historian and Holocaust teacher, Yehuda Bauer. Just a word about Yehuda Bauer. Yehuda Bauer published this has just recently celebrated his 95th birthday, and one must say that it's an admirable and enviable achievement for a scholar in his 10th decade to write a book that exceeds what he wrote in quality and importance, what he wrote in the folly of his youth a half century ago, and in the years of his biblical wisdom a quarter century ago. The work that Bauer presented is, could the U.S. government have rescued European Jewry, which is a re-examination and cuts deeply against much of what has been presented as the American and the American Jewish response. At 95, his courage is on full display because, in essence, it's a frontal attack on what we call the preferred narrative of Jews in the English-speaking world and in Israel, on the role of the American government and American Jewry with response to the Holocaust. What is the preferred narrative? American Jews were silent, ineffective, divided, timid, self-absorbed, weak, afraid to provoke even more anti-Semitism, and incapable of bringing a Judeo-centric request to the American political establishment. They did not come to the aid of their European brethren sufficiently. And the other point is that American Jews had the power to do something significant if only they had tried to use it. And the American government was anti-Semitic at best. It was anti-Semitic. At best, it was unconcerned with Jews, and when it was not antagonistic. And the U.S. government is responsible for sins of commission and omission. If only it were otherwise, many more Jews could have been saved. Some even go so far as to imagine that the Holocaust could have been prevented, its effects mitigated. The narrative was first developed in Arthur Morse's work, While 6 Million Died. It was put into Jewish consciousness, and I'd say general consciousness, with David Weinman's influential book, The Abandonment of the Jews. His earlier work, Paper Walls, did not have the widespread impact, even though within the scholarly community, the use of the term paper walls to deal with the pre-war obstacles to immigration is widespread. And ironically, we could say that we're experiencing now paper walls with regard to the processing of immigration, and the word should become familiar again. Wyman portrayed the abandonment has become ingrained within the American Jewish leadership and within the organized Jewish community, often with many positive consequences. It has been reinforced by seemingly an endless parade of articles and books attacking FDR, the State Department, the Jewish establishment, and many of Wyman's disciples, often under the banner of the Institute bearing his name and thus implying his imprimatur. For decades, it was a calling card of American Jewish institutions proclaiming that they had learned the lessons of the Holocaust, that they could protect American Jewry from a second Holocaust, or the imperiled fate of Israel from undergoing such a fate. The rescue of Soviet Jews, and to a lesser non-public extent, the rescue of Ethiopian Jews, offered American Jewry a do-over, an opportunity to do things right and to exercise its influence. And I know that it was on the minds of a new generation of American Jewish officials, secure at bringing Americans comfortable at being Jews in an American context, serving in governmental roles as they sought to use their position to assist Jews in need. Examples abound. Permit me only three. Richard Pearl and Mark Talisman, staff members of late Senator Henry Scoop Jackson and late Representative Charles Vanek, spoke of the American Jewish in action as inspiring them to propose the Jackson-Vanek Amendment, linking rates of immigration with U.S. relations with the Soviet Union and bringing the weight of the United States to the Soviet Jewry movement. Stuart Eisenstadt, President Jimmy Carter's chief of domestic policy, who had worked with and was deeply moved by Arthur Morse's work, was acutely aware of his responsibility as a Jew and as a public official when he asked President Carter to change his mind and make exception for those Iranians facing religious persecution after the hostage crisis, and to make an exception to the executive order banning Iranians from the United States. An intergovernment task force was formed, and Iranian Jews and Baha'i students were allowed to overstay their visas, remain in the United States. Living in Los Angeles, I see a daily representation of that community that came here in the aftermath of the fall of the Shah. At a mass demonstration in December 1987 on the eve of the summit between President Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev, Elie Wiesel proclaimed, "This march is 45 years overdue." Henry Feingold, who had written a widely respected book, The Politics of Rescue, commented that it was a comment that resonated most deeply with his audience. Government officials were also not immune to having internalized this preferred narrative. The most formidable example is former Vice President Walter Mondale, who spoke about the boat people at the International Conference in Geneva in 1979. And he spoke about the Evian Conference. At Evian, they began with high hopes, but they failed the test of civilization. Let us not reenact their error. Let us not be heirs to their shame. To alleviate the tragedy in Southeast Asia, we all have a part to play. The United States is committed to doing its share. Then Vice President George H.W. Bush had similar parallels in mind when he set off to negotiate the immigration of Ethiopian Jews to Israel. A word about Bauer's methodology in this small book. Context is all important. An empiricist, he is convinced by evidence. He argues from evidence, but often has a unique skill to put the cumulative evidence in a coherent and meaningful context. He's modest, uncharacteristically so perhaps, but he says many books and articles have detailed the facts and often different interpretations. This article is no exception. It offers no unknown facts, but tries to interpret them differently from other efforts of a similar nature. He asks a simple, clear, lucid, basic, essential, indispensable question. Rescued from what? The simple question yields very important distinctions. In 1933, German Jews were not saved from the Holocaust. He understands that the Holocaust as we know it was essentially began with the Holocaust as we know it, the so-called final solution to the Jewish question, defined as mass murder of the Jews, began in 1941, first by the mobile killing units, which were sent to stationary victims, and then beginning in late 1941 and early 1942, reversing the process, making the victims mobile by sending them on deportation trains and making the killing centers stationary where Jews could be killed with a remarkable impersonal involvement of their killers. His conclusion says as follows: as far as German Jews in the 1930s were concerned, the U.S. was not obliged to make special effort to save foreign nationals from a dictatorial and anti-Semitic regime in the midst of the worst economic depression America had experienced, though one may argue that there was a moral obligation to do so. The rest is commentary for the 1930s. We could end here, but like Hillel's famous quote in the Talmud, we understand that richness is to be found in the commentary, not in the conclusionary summation. Bauer argues that Wyman and his followers imply that the Roosevelt administration should have known something about what future perpetrators did not yet know, and future victims should have been able to be rescued before anyone knew that they would become victims. He maintains that Roosevelt did not oppose anti-Semitism, not necessarily because he had any particular love for the Jews, but because anti-Semitism threatened the kind of society he wanted to build. Also because it was an important topic of the propaganda of his enemy, the conservative Democrats and the Republicans, and generally of those who opposed the New Deal, the Jew deal, as many of them infamously called it. The Jews, after all, were part of his coalition, and like any good politician, he moved with his coalition. He never abandoned his coalition. The word Jew was never mentioned in the early 30s. The generic term refugee was used because any such emphasis would be grist for the mill of American anti-Semites. More importantly, as Henry Feingold properly noted, it is a distinction. If the distinction was made between Jews and non-Jews, only the latter would have been resettled, and the Jews would have been left stranded. He explores American opinion and understands American public opinion. He concerns himself less to the point with the implications for Roosevelt politically, a topic covered in Richard Breitman and Alan Lichtman's very important book, FDR and the Jews. A word about Lichtman and Breitman's book. They argue essentially that you have to understand the priorities of the Roosevelt administration in order to and its deep political needs in order to understand the decisions that were made. In the 1930s, very simply to recall Bill Clinton's phrase or James Carville's phrase, it's the economy, stupid. Roosevelt came to power. His major concern was getting America going again. And he, unlike Hitler, turned the nation, and unlike others who might today, turn the nation one toward another, not the nation one against another. In 1942, the worst year in Jewish history, it was the war, and the war. That was the first, second, third, and fourth priority. Roosevelt went to bed thinking about the war. He rose from his bed thinking about the war, and the war was not going well for the United States. And consequently, they also point out that there was a difference between 1938, when Roosevelt hosted the Evian conference, in 1939, when the MS St. Louis was turned away. That is, in 1938, Roosevelt thought he was no longer going to run for office, had political capital to spare, the economy had improved. And in 1939, he understood two things that the American people had not yet been told. One is that he was going to run for an unprecedented third term, and two, that in all likelihood America would have to get prepared to enter the war and ultimately would enter the war. And consequently, he did not want to spare political capital. That makes it understandable, if not morally acceptable, but still understandable. The conclusion to be drawn regarding American policies toward the Jewish plight during the 1930s is, yes, certainly more could have been done, especially until 1936, but the balance is not negative considering the background sketched by Wyman's paper walls, among others. As to Jewish reactions, it should be remembered that since ancient times, Jews were never a united community. And that is that one of the incredible myths is that the Jewish community speaks in one voice, has one priority. And one of the jokes Jews always tell themselves is two Jews are stranded on an island and they come after 5 years, and there are three different synagogues. One Jew would attend, the other Jew would attend, but they would never and they built a third, which neither of them would attend. But the important element, and the other moment that I think of is that in the Warsaw Ghetto, in April 19th, 1943, when the Jews rose in rebellion, the Jews fielded two armies that were not working with each other against a common enemy that was going to deport all Jews, men, women, and children of whatever political stripes, whatever religious or political persuasion. Jews fielded two armies because they could not agree on what the world would look like in the aftermath of the war, something that none of them or very few of them lived to see. So much for the first period. The second period is after the November pogroms, now known as Kristallnacht, and after September 1, 1939 to Pearl Harbor, which is December 7th, 1941. Although historians are wont to do it, I often suggest that students read a novel, Philip Roth's Plot Against America, to get the feel for those times. The U.S. was neutral. Roosevelt could only hope to govern if he maintained, at least formally, U.S. neutrality. Context is all important. The U.S. hardly had an army that could have intervened anywhere and for any purpose, and only begun building an air force. There was no effective intelligence organization. Bauer considers the context. The Jews in Eastern Europe, the main avenue of rescue was southern France. And what was needed was southern France. You had to go over the Pyrenees to Spain and Portugal. Visas were needed, money for bribes and for transit, and there were no American ships to bring these people to the shores of the United States. More could have been done, more should have been done. What the people who could have been saved were thousands, tens of thousands, but not the millions in need. Neutrals could have been assured that the expenses for the Jews they accepted would have been reimbursed, and that the Jews they offered a haven to would go elsewhere after the war. And this assuredly was not done. Historians now, and this goes to it, make a very important distinction brought in great clarity by the late Walter Lacour's book, The Terrible Secret, Suppression of Truth About Hitler's Final Solution, the difference between knowledge and information. Much information was available, but when it became knowledge, differed from individual to individual, from institution to institution. That leads us to ask the question that even if the information that was forthcoming in 1942, the Bund report, the Regner telegram, was believed, what exactly could be done? Military history and the capacity, American military history and the capacity of British military history lead to the conclusion that there were few realistic military options. America was at war, not going well. Germany was on the offense, nearing Stalingrad, nearing Moscow. U.S. victory was far from certain, and the U.S. was fighting for its way of life. Brightman and Lichtman support the conclusion. They argue that in 1942, the single priority for the U.S. government was winning the war. Everything else was subordinate to that goal, and the U.S. Jewish community concurred in that priority, given the nature of the war. The year 1942 was clearly the worst year in Jewish history. The Holocaust by bullets, namely the murder by Einsatzgruppen and their collaborators, their enablers, and even neighbors, was going full force in the Baltics and the occupied Soviet Union. Chelmno came online in December 41. Belzec opened in the winter, Sobibor in the spring, Treblinka on July 22nd. Deportations from the ghetto were going full stream. And that's the moment at which the Regner telegram came forth. Let's listen for a moment to the Regner telegram. And also we think of it in the context of the types of mistakes that were made with intelligence during the lead up to the war with Iraq. And that is that we didn't understand the nature of the limited nature of intelligence. The Regner telegram, that was actually not the Regner telegram, but the Sam Silverman's telegram, was received by Rabbi Stephen Wise, dated August 29th, 1942. Remember, August 29th, 1942 is a full 8 months after the Wannsee Conference, 8 months and 9 days after the Wannsee Conference. It is at a time when the gas chambers were working at Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka. The Jews of Warsaw were in the midst of the Great Deportation. 265,000 Jews were deported between the 23rd of July and the 21st of September. It's when the murders were being conducted by the Einsatzgruppen throughout Eastern Europe. And this is what essentially, this is word for word what Regner received. Reports stating that in Führer's headquarters, a plan has been discussed and being under consideration, according to which the total of Jews in countries occupied, controlled by Germany, numbering 3.5 to 4 million, should, after deportation and concentration in the East, at one blow be exterminated in order to resolve once and for all the Jewish question in Europe. Stop. Action is reported to be planned for autumn. Ways of execution still under discussion. Stop. It has been spoken of prussic acid. Stop. And this is very important to hear, in transmitting this information with all necessary reservation, as exactitude cannot be determined. Informant is stated to have close connections with the highest German authorities, and his reports have been generally reliable. Let's unpack that for 1 second. The report is out of date. These actions were not planned. They were essentially being conducted. By this time, they were in full-fledged operation on 2 fronts. Secondly, he only says that it's under discussion and implementation is the fall. It had been implemented beginning in June 1941. And you can read, informant is reported to have close connections with highest German authorities, and his reports have been generally reliable, which indicates a tentativeness as to how much of the telegram should be believed. And we know that Wise accepted this, went to the State Department, asked them for information. They could not confirm it. They then did confirm it by November, and that's the moment at which the State Department essentially screwed Wise, because Wise went public with the information, and the State Department said they could neither confirm nor deny that report. And interestingly enough, in the newly opened Vatican archives, we understand the U.S. government approached the Vatican for information in September and October and early November 1942. And the Vatican had the greatest intelligence operation in the area, because it had priests and neutral apostolic delegates or papal nuncios in each of the countries. They heard confessions. They could not repeat what was said in confession, but they certainly could report the general context of what they were experiencing. Pay attention to the words under discussion and consideration, Hitler's headquarters. Pay attention to action planned in the fall. Exactitude cannot be determined. Reports generally reliable. Cautious and hesitant, young, out of date. Killing had begun. It was in full-fledged operation. We have to consider the gap between Allied understanding of German intentions and the Nazi Germany's dual goal of domination within Europe and the annihilation of the Jews, which was seen in their mind as very central to the well-being and survival of the Jewish people. The Allies well understood Germany's desire for conquest and domination. They did not comprehend the role of Jews in the Nazi imagination, and thus their determination to eliminate the Jews. They did not understand the ideological confrontation the Nazis were engaged in with their chief enemy, the greatest danger to the Jewish people and to all of humanity in the Nazi mind were the Jews. And when I teach on anti-Semitism, I say you have to consider the source, you have to consider the goal, and you have to consider the priority. And for Nazi Germany, the priority of eliminating the Jews was central. Hitler has a seamless record virtually from 1919 to his final will and testament in 1945. It was an obsession, and it was a permanent determination and the highest of priorities. One of the central problems, Bauer writes, with the analysis of historians who accuse Roosevelt administration of not saving the Jews when they could have done so, is that they ignore the connection between the development of the military situation and American policies regarding the Jews. An almost naive belief in the power of the president to have come to the rescue of the European Jews, if only he had wanted to do so, is hard to explain. When he considers the controversy surrounding the non-bombing of Auschwitz, he once again is modest. I do not claim to have found additional primary sources for evaluating the question whether the U.S. could have or could have not bombed Auschwitz, the extermination camp at Auschwitz-Birkenau, or the railroads leading up to it. The picture in the U.S. was different, and the administration anti-Jewish statements in the State Department certainly played their part, but the main motivation was the line that Roosevelt himself advocated, namely that the emphasis that nothing could be done to create obstacles to winning the war. One of these obstacles was the rescue of those persecuted by Nazis, and so his thinking went. I taught for many years with a great man, one of the few men I've ever regarded as noble, Jan Karski, who had a private meeting with President Roosevelt, and whose last words from President Roosevelt was, "You tell your people that we shall win the war, and then we shall worry about, then we shall handle or deal with the refugee problem." We know that the issue of bombing revolves around two questions. What did they know? When did they know it? And what was the capacity of the U.S. military? Auschwitz was, when we conquered southern Italian bases, 528 miles away. The mission could have only been taken in good weather, going out heavy, coming back light. America had a policy of no suicide missions, and essentially it could only be conducted in daylight. Bauer is formidable in his understanding of U.S. and British military capacity. From my understanding, the mission could only have been taken from bases in Italy beginning the spring of 44, when the Jews were already murdered, but the knowledge was needed, and that came too late. Knowledge came from two escapees, Rudolf Verba and Alfred Wexler, who escaped on April 7th, made their way to Slovakia, where they slept their report, followed by Rosen and Mordovitz. But the information only made its way slowly to where it was needed. A complete copy was not received in Washington until November 1944. The gassing was already stopped in October. But where it made its way, it had an impact if, and I stress the word if, it was believed. Recall the distinction between knowledge and information. Let's not only deal with the Allies for a moment, but with the Yishuv, the Jews in Palestine, the name for pre-state Israel and the Jewish settlement in Israel. We understand the work of Richard Levy, who brought, even though his credentials were attacked because he was an engineer, not a historian, Levy brought to the attention the document of June 11th that the Yishuv's leadership under the role of David Ben-Gurion decided not to request that Auschwitz be bombed. The minutes reveal we do not know enough about the situation in Poland to approve of such bombing. So presuming, and I'm going to ask my audience to assume that David Ben-Gurion, his cabinet, including rabbis and other prominent Jews, founders of the State of Israel, presuming that they were not indifferent to the fate of the Jews, presuming that they were not anti-Semites, it's fair to say that as late as June 1944, non-anti-Semites, believing that they were operating in the best interests of the Jewish people, could have refused to advocate bombing. That changed when information reached Palestine, and by July 8th, Moshe Shertak and Chaim Weizmann, Shertak, who was later to become the first foreign minister and the second prime minister of Israel under the name Moshe Sharet, and Chaim Weizmann, Israel's first president, met with Anthony Eden, requested that Auschwitz be bombed. Eden took it to Churchill, who said, get anything out of the RAF, invoke my name if necessary. And yet Auschwitz was not bombed. The ball had shifted to America, and America did not pick it up. The War Department insisted that the use of military force for non-military purposes was out of the question. This was based on the memo of January 28th, 1944, by Major General Thomas J. Handy, Assistant Chief of Staff to the OPD, which stated that military means should be used only for the purpose of using the most effective means to defeat the enemy. Obviously, bombing a concentration camp was not seen as an effective means. I'm going to presume we all know the John J. Mcloy letter, in which Mcloy said there's been considerable opinion to the effect that such an effort, namely bombing Auschwitz, even if practicable, might provoke a more vindictive action on the part of the Germans. His response remains controversial. There had been no study of the bombing of Auschwitz. The War Department had decided that army units would not be employed for the purpose of rescuing victims of enemy oppression unless a rescue opportunity arose in the course of routine military operations. In February, U.S. War Department stated, we must constantly bear in mind that the most effective means of relief which can be given to the victims of enemy persecution is to ensure that the speedy defeat of the Axis. Bombing after early July 1944 would not have helped Hungarian Jews because deportations from Hungary stopped by July 9th, and the last deportation left for Auschwitz. Furthermore, Bauer offers massive evidence to demonstrate the bombing would not have been effective. Its chances of reaching the crematoria were slim, and the Allies did not know of Bunker 2 yet. There was a moral symbolism. Even assuming, Bauer writes, that Roosevelt had been an ardent lover of the Jewish people, could he have prevented the annihilation of millions? The answer is clearly negative. Could he have done more to rescue the thousands who could have been saved? Yes, but he could have done that even if he was an anti-Semite, which he was not. Because time is limited, let me leave out a section of the paper, and let me turn to a conclusion. Bauer writes, the problem goes, I believe, even deeper than that. Major rescue, it was said, was possible, but evil forces of the Roosevelt, the anti-Semitic cabal of the State Department, the bad leadership of the Jewish community prevented it. This is only an illusion, a delusion of major proportions, because it skews all the understanding of historical fact and their analysis. It encourages mysticism of interpretation of past events, especially when it's motivated by quite genuine and admirable moral outrage at what happened. Wyman, the son of Lutheran missionaries, is a very reliable historian who has not been found guilty of any inaccuracies in his presentation of facts and backgrounds. But anyone who reads his work realizes that behind the professional historian lies a person who is motivated by a wounded morality and whose major call is for moral accountability. The weakest part of Mauer's compelling argument is that he briefly alludes to the politics allowed in the argument. He asked, does Roosevelt stand for Obama, Bergson for Netanyahu, Stephen Wise for the Israeli and the American left? There is a political dimension to that. The issue is deeper. It has endured longer, easily traceable to Jimmy Carter and to each of the presidents who follow. Also reinforcing of Jews living in a hostile world without friends, American Jewry being weak in their Jewishness, unwilling to defend their fellow Jews. It is a right-left issue in the American Jewish community, with the right trying to weaken the Jewish ties to the Democratic Party and to the values of the New Deal. Permit me to omit his theological digression. Suffice it to say that self-blame is deeply ingrained in Jews from the prophets to the rabbis to the current days. Bauer's most important conclusion: the U.S. was not powerful enough, certainly not oily enough, and not well-positioned enough to save European Jews, and the Jewish community in the United States did not have the power to impose its will, even if it tried. It was a rabbi and Soviet Jewry activist, an ardent supporter of Israel, who summed up the moral argument that may distort historical judgment. The first part of his sentence agrees with Bauer. The last part overrides any historical judgment. Rabbi Haskell Lookstein said, the final solution may have been unstoppable by American Jewry, but it should have been unbearable for them, and it wasn't. This is important not only for our understanding of the past, but for our sense of responsibility for the future. When I reviewed the Brightman and Lichtman book, I insisted on the following title. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was the best of his generation in responding to the Holocaust, and the best of his predecessors and successors in responding to genocide. But that is no compliment. Let's take questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. That was quite remarkable. We'll start with, Abby's going to look at some of the questions coming in, but I have two questions for you. First, it seems as though this opinion about the Americans' ability to intercede has swung back and forth, and that we're seeing this pendulum swing much more into the sort of realistic appraisal of what was possible and a closer look at the timeline. Do you think that this is your position that right now is indicative of the general academic trend of what's being researched right now?
Look, I think it's indicative of a certain trend within the academia. It was always there, but it was overwhelmed by the intensity, the loudness, and also the sense of failure that the American Jewish community had, and the academics who were part of that community had, with regard to the failure to respond to the Holocaust. I think, and historians should not argue from contemporary days, but I think we should say a couple of things. Number one, we see the opposition to immigration, and there's a very interesting candidate for Senate who only last week said, when my grandparents came from the Holocaust, there was no worry that they might be terrorists or something like that, but the immigrants from Afghanistan, for example, are rather different. But there was a deep worry that Jews coming into the United States would either be communists or Nazi spies. And certainly there was the LPC document. They had to prove that they were not likely to become a public charge. And consequently, there was great resistance to receiving it. We also see the reticence of governments to respond to genocide. And part of that's part of the weakness, by the way, of the Genocide Convention. Best example of that is Bill Clinton's own guilt when the Marines were sent to rescue Americans in Rwanda, but nothing was done to stop the genocide, and that was a genocide of machete, and a genocide essentially that was done deliberately face to face. And again, it's not like the United States was not responding to the Nazi menace. World War II was being fought, it was being conducted, and no efforts were spared with regard to World War II. But again, the notion that one should respond to genocide is politically very difficult, even as it's morally necessary.
Right. One more question, and then we'll turn it over to Abby. One of the biggest issues, I think, is that people are looking at information available today and applying it to what was happening back then. Now, in fact, there was an American bombing raid at a factory near Auschwitz. And prior to that bombing raid, there was surveillance film taken of the area. And there were images of the Auschwitz-Birkenau camp that were included in those images. And that was used as evidence that the Roosevelt administration knew about the camp. But in fact, those images were not processed until the 1970s. Would you talk about that a little bit? Because it's
I have a whole section on. Let's begin by saying the man who prepared those images could have been the single most important man in the history of the world. Now, you may look at me as if I'm crazy, but let me explain. The man was Dino Brugioni, who was the most important CIA photo analyst. He is the man who brought us the Cuban Missile Crisis. Namely, he's the one who understood that the silos were being built and what was going into the silos. And in fact, he had private meetings one-on-one with John F. Kennedy, in which Kennedy wanted to understand how he could see so much from the sky. Brugioni worked, essentially said that since Bunamanowitz, which is the slave labor camp, was in a direct line to from Birkenau, the U.S. would have turned on aerial surveillance before Bunamanowitz, and in those days it wasn't film; it was rapidly taken single-frame pictures. He then developed the pictures. He also, when developed the pictures, he also imposed upon the pictures what we now know, namely the railroad tracks coming in, crematoria 2 and 3 on both sides of the railroad tracks, crematoria 4 and 5 to the right, beyond what we now call the sauna, the place where Jews were processed, where branding and shearing took place. And people presume that that could have been seen in 44. It was not seen in 44, and it was not developed in 44, and no one could have seen what was developed in 77 in 1944 because it was developed by 77 technology. I have a section on this about when those photographs were given to Elie Wiesel by Jimmy Carter. Wiesel was chairman of the President's Commission on the Holocaust, and we had prepared a memo. Brugioni, with me overlooking it, had prepared a memo to President Carter indicating clearly that those were not developed in 1944, that they could not be seen in 44, and that the labels were contemporary. That, by the way, that photograph was where, when George W. Bush visited Yad Vashem, he turned to Condoleezza Rice and he said, "Why wasn't Auschwitz bombed?" Because it seems as if you could know from what you saw exactly what was happening, but we can't read back into our contemporary knowledge what could have been known or should have or might have been known at that point.
All right, Abby, do we have some questions from our listeners? Why don't you go ahead and pose them to Michael?
Sure. We have a couple of different things. I don't know how many of them you can answer right now, but one of them has to do with people wanting the resources that you've mentioned in your talk of like a bibliography of kind of like key readings that people should do. So maybe that's something that you could share later. There's also a part, Rebecca Belding wants to know what was the part that you skipped in your talk. And then let's see.
So let's start in terms of bibliography. We're hoping that we will be able to post at least portions of Michael's essay, if not the entire one. We're working on that. We would love to be the distributor for that, which would have a lot of the bibliography. But we will make sure that the bibliography, all the books he's mentioned, will be listed on the website.
And there's a very important question from Daniel Green, and if I were to answer it, I would actually be turning it around Daniel Green, because the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum now has a very important exhibition called America and the Holocaust, which is the most extensive exhibition on America and the Holocaust that has been created. It was created by Daniel Green. He asked, what are the new directions in research that scholars, especially graduate students joining us, should take? What don't we know that should guide the next generation of scholarship on this topic? I would almost want to turn the question on Daniel Green and say that's critically important. I think that what I've sketched out is we need to, and Daniel has really charted new directions. He looked at what the hinterlands of America knew, not only what the elite knew, but what the common people did. The nature of the variety of responses in multiple American newspapers and journals and publications. He spoke about the ordinary person, what I call the uncommon common man, and explored a variety of things at that. All of this is brand new information presented very effectively by Daniel Green and his colleagues. And I would urge everybody on this, especially graduate students, to visit the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum's special exhibition on America and the Holocaust, and to pay deep attention to it. And I also, Paul, congratulate the FDR Library for presenting alternate perspectives on FDR's role in the Holocaust in the exhibition itself. And I think that museums should be provoking questions and should have the courage to present, and presidential libraries are a good example of this, should have the courage to present different points of view. I was just in Independence, Missouri, I guess on Monday, and visited the Truman Library, and Truman Library has this incredible thing where you can listen to Truman's speech on MacArthur and MacArthur's speech on MacArthur's farewell speech, which is an attack on Truman. That probably could not have been in the library when Harry Truman was alive and the like. He probably would have said, don't put that bloody, I won't quote it, on the like bloody thing in the museum. MacArthur can go to hell, and that may be too gentle a place for him. Abby, you have some more questions.
There's a question about kind of connections between your assessment of FDR and the Torah portion that was from the recent Torah portion.
Yeah, Marilyn Shaw has a wonderful comment. The rabbis, there's a word in the Torah portion of last week. Noah was a righteous man in his generation. Now, the rabbis are absolutely wonderful in their commentary. They say, why did it say in his generation? Had he lived in another generation, he would not have been righteous and would not have been considered righteous. So again, FDR was the best in his office, but that's not a compliment, because again, part of the historical record has been the assessment that we have not responded to genocide appropriately, forcefully enough, sufficiently enough. We have failure after failure after failure after failure. And in fact, in my thinking has changed. I no longer will ever say the words never again, except if I add to that, not with my acquiescence, not with my silence, not without my significant opposition, because genocide is a recurring phenomenon, occurring even as we speak. And consequently, the confidence of never again is virtually blasphemous.
There's another question from Barbara Sweet relating to the connection between slavery era pictures and documents being preserved here in the United States and what Germany might be doing in terms of preservation of sites related to and documents related to the Holocaust?
Germany has done a pretty good job of preservation and also of reminding it. I want to point out and do this in tribute. I said here something that could have been said by Angela Merkel, which is that about Angela Merkel. Franklin Delano Roosevelt's opposition to anti-Semitism, let's leave out whether he loved or didn't love the Jews, was because he didn't want an American society in which anti-Semitism was prevalent. And that is, it wasn't the type of America he wanted to build. And I'm deeply mindful of the fact that most particularly Angela Merkel, and there's been a transformation in Germany. Well, remember back to Bitburg when essentially Germany's political leadership wanted to say the Holocaust era has ended, and now we are what? Now we can put that behind, and that was part of the reason that President Reagan was invited to Bitburg, and part of the reason why the chancellor was insistent that he go. We can say of Merkel in her historical record that, and I don't want to disparage her affection or non-affection to the Jews, but the reason that she was so vehemently opposed to anti-Semitism was she didn't want a Germany in which anti-Semitism was possible. She didn't want that hate. She didn't want that venom. She didn't want the Nazis to be able to come out of the woodwork and continue. And that is a very important value in combating the type of hatred that we have. If we have a leadership that doesn't want anti-Semitism, doesn't want racism, that doesn't want xenophobia, that doesn't want a whole range of things, because that's not the America they want to build. That's a far more dependable set of values than if they have particular affection for one group, one persecuted group or another. And I think that Bauer's remarks on that are very important, and they echo in contemporary leadership. So Germany's done a pretty good job. Other countries have done less well, and Germany has the memorial stones. It has, and again, I wrote many years ago about the memorial that was built in Germany, and I joked that I could have given a PhD on how not to build a memorial. The famous Peter Eisenman Memorial in Berlin. The first proposal was too powerful. The second proposal was not powerful enough. The third proposal was too sad. The other one was too hopeful. One was essentially too large, too small. And finally, it was like the Goldilocks story, that they came to a conclusion and then they condensed the Eisenman thing. But what really makes the Eisenman Memorial work is not the Eisenman Memorial, with all due respect to it, but precisely that underneath the Eisenman Memorial in the study center, they have inch for inch, pound for, square meter for square meter, one of the most powerful exhibitions on the Holocaust. And I say that as a person who's built 8 or 9 or 10 museums, and therefore I have respect for my colleagues. They've done a remarkable job, which makes it work, because memorials don't work unless you remember what is being memorialized. Scholarship is very important, and scholarly documents, and here we've had tremendous efforts to preserve these documents over the past generation, investments in that and gathering in that. And one of the things I'm proud about in my work in the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum is how not only we brought these documents together, but we made them available. And we even partnered with Yad Vashem, so there are duplicates of what we have in Washington at Yad Vashem, which gives you 2 places in which you can get the material. And the faster we make it online, the better off we have, because during COVID, we all know we couldn't spend all the time that we needed to spend in archives.
Abby, you want to ask that next question? Then I have a final question for Michael.
So should I go ahead and ask?
Yeah.
Okay. So We've got a question from Svetlana. She says, some literary scholars and historians alike have been reluctant to pass moral judgment in their talks, not only during this conference, but in other academic conferences, when it comes to arguably evident policy failures of governments, as well as certain individuals' moral failures during the interwar and World War II periods. Thinking of this in the context of literary criticism and new criticism in particular, has the history not shown that impersonality in, let's see, we got cut off. Impersonality in academic and creative works cannot be sustained as one undeniably portrays one's personal beliefs within one's writing, even unintentionally.
Okay.
Do you want to respond to that at all?
Yeah, I can respond very briefly, which is that I have profound, deep moral concerns that underline all of my work, that I try to be as objective as possible in my assessment of historical information and try to separate what I find from the moral judgment that I bring to find. And also, many years ago, I read a book by Kenneth Keniston called Young Radicals. And he offered a piece of methodology. He said, in the social sciences, there may not be so much objectivity as allowing the reader, let's say the audience, to understand the nature of one's subjective biases, in this case, moral conclusions. I don't believe they're subjective. I believe that there's an objective, there are objective elements of morality, revealing what those subjective perspectives are and allowing the audience, the reader, to compensate accordingly. So I don't shy away from moral judgments, but I think that confusing moral judgments with historical evidence without revealing when you're dealing with historical evidence and when you're dealing with moral judgments is not particularly helpful. Suffice it to say that. And by the way, the other part of it is that I have always, in my work, tried not only to deal with the abstract, but also the personal. I interviewed a couple of weeks ago a wonderful filmmaker who spoke of 6,000,001 and 6,000,000 ones, meaning that the story of the individual becomes all important. And in fact, we concluded with individual stories at the exhibition in the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. And we concluded that by remembering a TV show that, Abby, you're probably too young to remember. And I'm not sure of Paul's age, but certainly I remember, was a New York detective series, a lousy New York detective series thing that had one great line. Detective series was called The Naked City. And the one great line it had is, there are 8 million people in this naked city, 8 million stories, and this has been one of them. I believe in understanding the personal dimension of this history we define, and that's probably one of the reasons why I work in film and museums and not only in straight academic writing.
All right, we're running out of time, so I'm going to ask you a last question. We want to look towards the future. How do we engage the next generation? Recent studies showed that only 25% of high school students even knew what the Holocaust was. Their best estimate was that 2 million Jews had died. There's an active campaign of Holocaust denial that's taken root across the world. How do we engage the next generation, helping them understand what happened and how we have to be proactive to prevent it from happening again?
Paul, I deal with that question when I wake up in the morning and when I go to sleep at night. Let me say that our danger now is not Holocaust denial. Our danger is Holocaust distortion. And our danger also is that there is a deep political character of our times that seeks to trivialize the Holocaust. Let's forget about what your position on masks are. And let's also forget that Jews were not given gold stars. They were, in many countries, they had to wear yellow stars. In Poland, they had to wear white armbands. Symbolization is one of the stages of genocide. And Jews were symbolized. It was a task to murder, to identify, because Jews are of all colors, all different shapes and sizes, and again, come in different forms. And consequently, you had to mark them in order to isolate them, in order to persecute them, in order to define them, in order to attack them, and the like. So we have that type of trivialization. We also have a fantastically vile image that was circulating in England of the gates of Auschwitz saying, vaccines make you free, which presumes that the visitor understands the iconography of the Holocaust. And if you understand the iconography of the Holocaust, it may be that you don't understand details, but you understand something, and you understand what I call in my work the Holocaust as the negative absolute. In a world of relativism, we don't know what's good, we don't know what's bad. One thing people agreed upon was that the Holocaust was evil. Our problem today, though, is there's also a segment politically that wants to repeat the Holocaust. So the idea that somebody could wear on January 6th Auschwitz staff, or that there is a shirt which says 6MWE, 6 million wasn't enough, means that there's a desire for repetition. There's a famous Hasidic story. Religious Jews are not allowed to smoke on the Sabbath. A very famous Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Berditchev, was walking down his town. He sees a boy that he knew, that he taught, who's Jewish, and he says, "You're smoking. Do you understand it's Sabbath?" He says, "Of course, Rabbi, I understand it's Sabbath. I studied with you. Do you understand that smoking is prohibited on the Sabbath?" He says, "Of course, I understand that smoking is prohibited on the Sabbath." He turns to God. He says, he may be violating the Sabbath, but at least he knows it's wrong. So the idea that they're wearing these sweatshirts, as it were, in these shirts, means that you have people who understand the Holocaust in its own dimension are attracted to its repetition. That's very different than denial.
Yeah.
It's a pernicious character of our moment in history. And part of, again, let me conclude with this. With all my criticism of Roosevelt, the major element that Franklin Roosevelt did, and Roosevelt and Hitler came to power at approximately the same time. Hitler, January 30th, 1933. Roosevelt, March 4th, 1933. They both came to a society with somewhere in the neighborhood of 25% unemployment, maybe 40% of decrease in gross national product. Adolf Hitler turned the society one against another. Franklin Delano Roosevelt turned the society one toward another. And I think the only way we're going to get out of our abyss at this moment is if we turn toward each other and not against each other. And that's a great legacy of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, one for which the American people and the world should still be grateful.
Michael Berenbaum, thank you so much. This was an important and historic conclusion to our conference. Your words today are inspiring and haunting and sobering, but I appreciate it so much. And I think your work has made a lasting impression on so many people. To conclude our conference, I want to turn to Abby Gandek. She was really the producer of this whole conference. She's done a truly remarkable job. There's nothing that I can say to indicate how effective she has been, how wonderful she's been, all the coordination. You can imagine how difficult this was. So Abby, we're going to give you the final words at the end of the 2021 virtual conference.
Well, thank you so much for saying that, Paul. And thank you, Michael, for a super interesting and moving and important keynote. Thank you all so much for attending our virtual conference, Examining American Responses to the Holocaust, Digital Possibilities. And we hope you will watch the recorded sessions on the FDR Library's YouTube channel, especially the ones that you might have missed or you didn't get to catch the whole thing. And we also wanted to say that we hope you'll visit the library in the future and that we welcome your support. And thank you so much for being here and participating.